another another eventful week, right? Isn't it?
Tell me, tell me about it. Absolutely.
Okay, I want to start with China. So, I don't think there's a whole lot of report about it, but this two fishermen killed in Jinmen is pretty serious. So, I'm sure you know that, right? The two mainland fishermen they were killed in Jinmen. Now, Jinmen is an area very close to mainland. If you look at the map, it's actually
Mm,
further away from Taiwan. It's very close to mainland. But
mm,
anyway, it's actually pretty common for fishermen from both sides to cross the so-called border. There's some kind of border, but it's all in the water, so nobody knows,
mm,
right? So people cross it. So the whole thing is extraordinary in the sense that this kind of thing happened a lot in the past. It never caused any friction, real friction. But this time,
mm,
two fishermen were actually killed. The boat was, there was a collision with the
mm,
Taiwan's Coast Guard boat.
mm,
And the problem is that the Taiwan still refused to show the footage. They even in the beginning denied there was a footage, the video footage of what happened. So they never was truthful, and they refused to apologize, refused to pay compensation. They're willing to pay a little bit of money, but they call it a donation of some sort. So there's no wrongdoing from their side so
mm.
far. They don't admit to that. What the remarkable about this is that everybody in China believes that Taiwan would never dare to do something like that without the US support. So the interpretation here is the US is testing China's limit. And of course, US always do that, right? US always
Mm,
does that, the push and
mm,
push the limit. And then eventually people will get upset and something will happen. I actually
mm,
think there's some merit to that speculation. And if that's true, I don't think the Chinese government will take the bait, this time at least. But the tension is high and people are really angry. If you read online, everybody's saying you cannot just let it go like this. So, what is your take on that? Biden has this. I firmly believe that Biden himself believe war is good for his election. I mean, what do you think?
I think this is absolutely correct. I mean, I agree entirely with this view that you've expressed, which, from what you say, appears to be the general view in China. This was an incredibly aggressive step. I mean, to do this to fishermen is just. I mean, it is ridiculously aggressive. I mean, whatever fishing boats are doing, they're not any conceivable threat to any kind of security situation. I mean, there are problems with fishermen in many countries. I mean, we have them in England. I mean, there's all kinds of problems with fishermen from Spain and even from Russia, by the way, fishing in British territorial waters, and coast guards do all sorts of things. But for people to actually get killed is extraordinary. And the behavior of the tiny Taiwanese authorities is unusually, I mean, extremely provocative as well. I mean, refusing to pay compensation, refusing to apologize, refusing to provide any kind of explanation, real intelligible
Yeah.
explanation for what happened, refusing to provide film of what happened,
Mhm.
pretending that there is no film of what happened, which is inconceivable, by the way, and is an insult to people's intelligence. It is unbelievably provocative, but it is the style. It is the current style, always to test the limits of the other side. The United States has been doing this for decades to the Russians, needling them here, pushing them there, sending warships close to Crimea. I'm sure you remember that, was it 2 years ago, a British warship sailed in uh, um, the territorial waters of Crimea, just close to Sevastopol. And they do this constantly. And um, if the other side exercises restraint, this is represented as a sign of weakness, a
Mhm.
sign that their bluff has been called, a opportunity to act even more aggressively in future. And then, on the contrary, if the other side does respond and responds firmly, this is represented as a sign of the other side's aggressiveness and bellicosity and things of this sort. Now, what this incident shows is that the United States is becoming, and it is the United States, is becoming more aggressive towards China. And I have been just on a program for my own channel in which I've been discussing certain interesting signals that have been coming from the United States. The fact that the United States may be thinking hard now about wrapping up the Ukrainian project, which is clearly not going well. But if they are doing that, I'm not sure that is the case, then as night follows day, they're looking to increase their belligerence somewhere else. And the Taiwan Strait is an obvious one. Given that people who may be or may pretend to be realists on the Russian issue are generally in America even more aggressive about China than they are about Russia itself. That is, I mean, so-called realists in the United States aren't really, in my opinion, realists at all. They're just people who are more antagonistic to China than they are to Russia.
And they also, I think some of them don't like the Ukraine war. Not necessarily they don't like the war. They don't like Ukraine losing the war. They see that Ukraine cannot win this thing, then they kind of like, why we wasting time, right? I think if Ukraine really is winning, they might not saying this is bad. I think some of them is like that.
Oh, absolutely. You're completely correct. If Ukraine was winning, everybody in Washington would support it. Now that Ukraine is losing, well, that leads to two things. Firstly, you've got to limit the damage, the prestige damage to the United States. And that might mean sort of distancing yourself a bit from it, dumping it all on the Europeans, getting them to send troops to Ukraine and do all kinds of things of that kind. But at the same time, you then, in that case, need to show to the Chinese that you are strong, that the Chinese can't, expect that because you're retreating in Ukraine, they can push us around in Taiwan. And that means, of course, that instead of acting with restraint, you act even more belligerently and aggressively. This is very much the style of American policy at this time.
Yeah. And I wonder whether Victoria Nuland's retirement has something to do with it. Do you see that as a sign of shifting of the policy shifting? Is that part of they're wrapping up?
You see, we don't really know because, of course, nobody's going to explain this to us. But Victoria Nuland has been the, mother of this crisis. I mean, she's obsessed. It's known that she's obsessed by Ukraine. She was there on Maidan Square, handing out the cookies to the protesters. She was picking the government of Ukraine in a telephone call that the Russians were listening in on, and of which they released a transcript. She's been one of the most fervid and extreme supporters of Ukraine and of the hard line towards Russia. And just a few months ago, at the end of last year, she was promoted to the position of a Deputy Secretary of State. She's just been in that post for a few weeks, and now suddenly we hear that she's retiring. Now, this doesn't make a huge amount of sense, not in American terms. It begs many questions. And the person who is apparently taking over from her is a much less, well-known person called John Bass. But he's a career diplomat, and he's best known, apparently, for being the senior diplomat who was in charge of managing the US's withdrawal from Afghanistan. I mean, he didn't do the logistical side, but he did the political elements of this. So it's interesting that of all the people in the State Department, a person with a reputation for managing withdrawal is being brought in to take over Nuland's place. But again, it's important to stress it might be better news for the Russians in Europe. It's not better news for the world, because whenever this sort of thing happens, we saw that with the Afghanistan withdrawal. All it does is it makes the United States even more belligerent and aggressive in other places. And there is a very, very strong mood in the United States at the moment, which is being built up and stoked up to some extent, by the Republican Party and even to a less extent now, but quite plausibly before long, Donald Trump himself, that the true enemy, the real enemy of the United States is China. They're the existential threat to us. Ukraine was a diversion. We need to focus on the Chinese. And this could explain, some of the latest moves that we're seeing with the fishermen and other things of that kind.
We need to see them combined. Yeah. Now, talking about like a Trump and Biden, so yesterday was Super Tuesday. It seems like it's going to be a rematch, right? Trump and Biden rematch. And Nikki Haley, I just saw she suspended her campaign. I mean, that's not surprising. But what is discouraging for me, I mean, Trump and Biden, I really don't think they're that big difference. Ultimately, like you said, Trump very hawkish against China. So we will see. And Trump himself may be more reluctant to really get the United States into the war, but the people he hires, right? He hired John Bolton and Pompeo, those type of the most hawkish people. So but anyway, what is really disappointing to me is the California senator race, Adam Schiff. I'm sure you know Adam Schiff is this warmonger, Russiagate person. I really thought they had a good candidates like Barbara Lee, who is a very strong anti-war candidate. She is the only vote I think voted against the Iraq War. So I really hope that people like her could get into Senate. Get some sensible people. But she lost, and even Katie Porter, who also has a lot of followers, who is more moderated than Adam Schiff, that didn't win. So it's very disappointing that Adam Schiff, in California being California, Adam Schiff, when the primary means he's heading to the Senate. What is
absolutely. I mean, California is going to vote a Democrat, and it's going to be Adam Schiff, and you characterize him absolutely exactly. I mean, I should say that I find him one of the most dangerous people in American politics. One of the most unprincipled, one of the most, mendacious and deceitful. He played an absolutely instrumental role in creating the Russiagate hysteria. He said all kinds of things over the course of Russiagate, which were straightforwardly untrue, and which he must have known when he said them were untrue. I mean, he is a most dangerous man. He is also, it must be said, somebody who is extremely close to the Democratic Party leadership. So he, as far as they're concerned, he served their interests well. He served their interests well during Russiagate, during the various impeachments, during the campaigns to bring social media under control. So it's unsurprising that they made sure that he's the person who is coming into the Senate. But it is a very, very bad sign. But it also highlights the underlying point that there aren't any real moderates in Washington within the Beltway. There are some people who are more antagonistic to Russia. There are some people who are more antagonistic to China. But there is no one, outside, people like Rand Paul, who is he's there and we all listen to him and admire him, but he is far from being, at the center of power. There is no one at the center of power who argues for disengagement. Donald Trump sometimes sort of does, but as you correctly say, he's very easily diverted and manipulated. And, one senses that even he, deep down, still thinks it's the job of the United States to sort of go around roughing up people and bullying them and being horrid and aggressive to them, laying down the law to them and all that kind of thing. A genuinely realist policy based on peace has very, very few advocates within the political class in America.
I mean, it's so disappointing. I mean, I tried. I probably shouldn't be surprised because he is, huge the Democratic establishment, and then huge donors backed him, and so eventually, big money wins. So that's not really surprising. Yeah. But we do have some good news from Britain, right? George Galloway. Now you and Alex Christopher, you talked about that in Duran, how panicked the British establishment has been. Now, what I find amazing, and I can't really understand how the whole reaction to his election. He's one vote, right? The House of Commons has 650 seats or something.
That's right.
He has one seat, and yet they are so panicking. Now they're panicked that we talked about Galloway will be a powerful voice, but it's just one voice, right? But I guess even that they are still panicking, they are still afraid. What I don't understand is that, well, if they are so afraid of him being elected, why did they make it so big, right? Why do they make it like worse to make his election such a big deal by talking so much about it, by dismiss it? The way they attack him is almost exactly the same that Donald Trump was elected, how they attacked him, like, oh, the democracy is in danger. They attacked the whole election. They attacked his voters, isn't it? I mean, why do they make it bigger than it is?
You're absolutely correct. I mean, if they had, two grey cells to rub together, they would say, look, all right, Galloway's been around for a long time. He's an actual genuine peace candidate. I mean, I should declare the fact that I know him. I mean, we don't know each other well, but we've appeared on platforms together in support of Julian Assange, I should say. I agree with his foreign policy stances. He is someone who generally does want peace, by the way. I mean, he is very, very, very strongly opposed to the aggressive policies of the British government towards China and of the Western powers towards China. I mean, and I know he talks about that less because it's a less immediately urgent thing, but that doesn't mean that he feels less strongly about it. I know personally that he feels very strongly about it. In fact, it's the thing that worries him most. Now, why are they reacting in this hysterical way? Because it is, I mean, the response from our Prime Minister Rishi Sunak to Galloway's election was absolutely hysterical, coming out onto the steps of Downing Street, talking about democracy in danger. This terrible man has won in Rochdale. Public order is about to collapse. Armies of Islamic militants are preparing to take over. All that. I mean, it was a ludicrous thing. The reason that they are scared is because they are very, very insecure. They know that probably a majority, in fact, I am sure a majority of people in Britain agree with George Galloway. I mean, you saw that in Rochdale. I mean, it wasn't just Muslim votes that voted for him. He did actually very well amongst working class white English voters as well. They support him. They don't want forever wars. They don't want this aggressive foreign policy that looks for enemies all over the world. They don't want any of that. And what they worry about is that Galloway is actually quite well known in Britain. I mean, he's been around, as I said, for a long, long time. He's now back in Parliament. They're worried that he will be a disruptive force in Parliament. They worry that he'll be able to speak out and criticize their policies. He's talking about bringing other people together and running candidates in other seats, other Labour seats. And that's making some Labour MPs very nervous because they sense that, again, working class voters in their seats who are left wing inclined, might come out and support him. So it portrays the nervousness and the fear and the panic of what is actually a very insecure political class, a secure political class, a self-confident one which felt that it was firmly in control of the country, will just brush off George Galloway. They say he's been around a long time. It's not going to change anything. He's won amongst 600. It's not going to change anything much.
Yeah.
But they know that if there was a real open election, if people were able to vote and had choices, real choices in that election, that 600 pro-war MPs, that number would shrink dramatically, and that's what scares them. That's what scares them about him. And of course, they are also conscious of the fact, about Galloway specifically, that he's one of the very few political leaders who is able to cut through all the media blockades, the censorship, all of that, because he's a very, very powerful orator, and a very skillful debater. And people listen to him and search him out.
Yeah, so I guess they're afraid not just this one seat that taken by him. They're afraid of the whole movement behind him, I
Yes.
guess. Yeah.
Yes,
Okay.
in a system. I mean, somebody put it wonderfully. I forget who it was. That in the empire of lies, speaking the truth is a revolutionary act, and having somebody come into Parliament now and talking the truth about all of these things is a revolutionary act, and
Mhm.
of course, in a system which, as I said, is insecure and is worried about, well, I won't say exactly a revolution, not, revolution in the way that, Russia had and China had in 1911 and 1949. It's not that kind of revolutionary atmosphere, but in a system where the political class knows it's disliked and distrusted, and most people disagree with it, having that kind of person come out, that's very unsettling, and it's led to the overreaction that there has been.
Mm. Exciting to see. I'm exciting to see
Oh yeah,
what he,
absolutely,
yeah.
absolutely.
Like you said, he's a
Uh,
very good debater. Yeah. Yeah.
oh, he's a brilliant debater.
Yeah.
Can I also quickly on the topic of Galloway? Now I don't know this for a fact, but I've personally come to the conclusion that the Labour Party itself acted to undermine its own candidate in Rochdale by engineering this scandal around something that he said, because they knew that if they ran him against Galloway, he would have lost. So they didn't want the imagery of Galloway winning against a Labour candidate, because there'd been all kinds of very strange manipulations and machinations around Galloway. But the fact is, Galloway won more votes than the Conservative, Liberal, and Labour parties together. And the person who came second is an independent businessman who has no connection to any of the three major parties. So that tells you how mistrustful of the political class the British people have become.
Yeah. Yeah. And that scares them. I think that's really
And
scares them.
yeah,
Yeah.
yes.
Okay. Middle East. Now, Biden dropped some food in Gaza. Okay, it's good. But I have to say, this is the Chinese media. Their comment about this is that it's easy to remember evil people's occasional good deeds. Fewer can truly understand the difficulty to persistently do good. I think that's pretty good summary. I would say this. I think everybody knows Biden could just stop providing weapons to Israel. This problem
Mm,
solved, but he doesn't. So he's doing these kind of a political stunt, almost like a uh, to make people feel. Of course, the mainstream media made a big deal out of it. Okay, it shows that he's sympathized to the Palestinian people's lives, etc. But in reality, it's not. This is a political stunt. This is an optics, in my view. And by dropping food like that, I actually think it's a pretty bad idea because the people are hungry and desperate. So when you drop food like that, isn't that kind of like a hunger game? People will fight for it,
mm,
and etc.
mm,
And that's possibly why Israel agrees to it, that Israel is fine with seeing this hunger game among the Palestinians, and Israel knows that this will not make much of a difference, if anything. I think the whole thing angers me that Biden and the people around him, I guess, who give him this idea, would think that we, the public, are so dumb that we don't see through this, that we will fall for it. What is your
I,
reaction?
I completely agree. I was absolutely furious when I heard about this.
Yeah.
I mean, the cynicism of it is off the scale. I mean, you facilitate a war against Gaza. You assist Israel conduct an essential blockade of Gaza, which is, by the way, a war crime. Let's remember that it is a war crime, you basically make sure that your friends in the International Criminal Court, which your friends in Europe have set up, don't bring any kind of claims in relation to the war crimes that Israel is committing in Gaza, even though Palestine has ratified the Rome Statute. Much good it's done them. And you drop a little amount of food on a starving population, which is being bombed, shelled, and attacked every day, and come out and say, this shows that I'm a good person and that I mean well. I mean, it is terrible. I actually think, by the way, that it's backfired. I think that the impression I have here in Britain, where most people today, by the way, strongly support a ceasefire, is that exactly as you said, people have seen through the cynicism of this thing. If the people of Gaza are so desperate for food that you have to drop food, to prevent them starving, which isn't going to prevent them starving because you can only drop small amounts of food, then surely what you need to do is to stop the fighting in Gaza, agree a ceasefire, end the blockade, and make sure that the people in Gaza are properly supplied and fed and saved. It's a terrible thing. And it does make me wonder about who exactly runs things in Washington and the kind of ethics that these people have.
And in the meantime, also Kamala Harris came out saying she she said, "Oh, we need a ceasefire," and then she waited for the applause, and then said for the next 6 weeks. You see,
Yeah.
this kind of thing, I don't know. I'd much rather they just say it. Well, we're going to support Israel no matter what. Okay, that's it. End of the story. I mean, they have to put up shows, right? The tokens like this. It's just so disgusting. But
it's deeply manipulative,
yeah.
and it treats us all as fools, exactly as you said.
But in the meantime, within Israel, that there are some high-level resignations, right? In particular, in the military, IDF's spokesperson's office, there were some people, quite a few of them resigned. So it seems like Israel itself inside is not that stable either, it seems to me. But it seems like they are going to continue to fight even during the Ramadan. Is that how it's going to be? Because it seems like Biden does want to see maybe 6 weeks at Ramadan time to have a ceasefire, but that is not going to happen. Is that how it's going to be?
Absolutely. I don't think there's going to be a ceasefire. I mean, a ceasefire for 6 weeks? It's just another gesture. I mean, partly it's intended to get the hostages released. I want to see the hostages released. I want to make that absolutely clear. I don't think hostages should be taken. I think taking hostages is wrong. But the reason they want the hostages released is not humanitarian reasons, simple, straightforward humanitarian reasons. It's because by getting the hostages released, they hope to be able to escalate their military campaign in Gaza. In other words, kill more people. So again, the whole thing is manipulative. What is in the end intended to facilitate a war is being represented as an act of humanity and peace. It is turning the whole of language upside down. And of course, it's making people around the world more and more angry because, of course, they can see through it. And, I mean, I don't know what more to say. I mean, you're absolutely right about what you said about Kamala. She gives the impression that she's disagreeing with the Israelis, whereas in fact, of course, ultimately, what she's doing is working to assist them as they do what they do. Now, Israel itself is in deepening crisis. The military campaign has not gone well.
Yeah.
I think they expected that they'd wrap it up in a few weeks. Military people I consulted said that was impossible. The military people have been right, but the military people weren't listened to. And so they've got themselves bogged down in unending conflict in Gaza. There are increasing strains within the Israeli government because there's so many recriminations and arguments about this. And Israel's economy is imploding. And I think this is the other big story. There's been a 20% contraction in GDP. I've heard that 500,000 people have left Israel. Yeah. This is a relatively small population of 8 million people. The high-tech industries that were previously doing very well, apparently they're being badly affected because a lot of the younger, better educated people who work for them are leaving. Israel is in a trap, and the government doesn't know how to get out of it. And I say this also, I mean, I'm not a friend of Prime Minister Netanyahu's, not by any means, massive critic of him, always have been. But if the United States had really been concerned about Israel's best interests, when the Israelis were talking about launching an operation in Gaza back in October, the US government, the Biden administration, should have come along and said to them, don't do this thing. This is going to be a mistake. You're walking into a trap. Go to the United Nations, get the support of the international community, say that you were the target of a terrorist attack, try to win sympathy, international sympathy and support in that way. But of course, this administration never thinks in those terms. They encourage the Israelis to launch this attack on Gaza, and Israel itself is in a trap. And you can see that the strains are now getting greater within Israel. People are resigning. There's apparently arguments between Israeli ministers all the time. And the political situation is deteriorating.
But isn't that make Israel even more dangerous? Could Netanyahu do more extreme things, isn't it?
That's exactly correct, because at the same time as all of this is happening, what you're seeing is an increasing radicalization, because the people who are left in Israel are the ones who are the most committed to this whole enterprise. And they are anyway already dangerously ascendant within the Israeli government. And you have all these very, very hardline, I would even say fanatical people like like Smotrich, who's the finance minister, Ben Gvir, who is the security minister. And they are seeing Gaza not as a terrible war in the way that most people do, but as an opportunity to gain control of Gaza, to advance the project for a greater Israel, one which incredibly involves reconstituting the temple in Jerusalem, the one that the Romans destroyed all those thousands of years ago. And also at the same time, tightening control of the West Bank and restructuring Israeli society. So you see a radicalization is going on, and they're using the war in that way, and they're working on the fears of people in Israel. And Israeli society is becoming radicalized also. And the stance of the Biden administration is facilitating that.
Biden, I mean, the U.S. in general, but Biden administration in particular, I think like to pour gasoline on fire. I think that's what they're very good at that.
That is their instinct with every crisis. A friend of mine, Garland Nixon, whom I think actually wrote to me before the Ukraine war began. He said this is an incredibly dangerous administration. They are looking for fights everywhere, with the Russians, with the Chinese, in the Middle East. He was absolutely right.
Yeah, they are very dangerous. Yeah, they're very powerful. You see, that's the part that makes them dangerous, right?
Yes.
Okay, about Europe, this whole affair. Now, I actually talked to another self-media person, a Chinese guy living in Germany, and so I talked to him about this whole thing that German media calls it the wiretapping affair, right? Those high-level military guys talking about sending the tourists cruise missiles to attack the Kerch Bridge. I mean, this is outrageous.
Mm.
What's interesting is this to me, like, remember we were talking about that Macron was last time we talked about Macron saying, okay, he doesn't rule out the boots on the ground. And none of us really think he's that serious. But later he actually did came out and said, I'm serious. And then shortly after that, this leak came. Now, is there, I mean, it's not a whole lot to report about that, but I got the sense Macron and Scholz, they don't get along very well. Fundamentally, Germany and France always have tensions. Is that right?
That's absolutely correct. In fact, I mean, this has been um, a major aspect of European history since the 18th century, that France and Germany have uh, nearly always been in conflict. One of the purposes of creating the European, what became the European community, what became the European Union in the 1950s, was to try and find a way to manage this conflict. You have the German leader at that time, Konrad Adenauer, and the French leader, Charles de Gaulle, and they wanted to create a structure whereby Germany and France would remain sovereign states and would balance each other within a European structure in which neither would threaten the other and where they would be able to cooperate together. Uh, what has happened since then is that France has become weaker economically, Germany has become stronger, Germany has gained greater predominance in the European institutions, especially since German unification in the 1990s. And that has led to tensions with the French resenting German leadership and trying to assert themselves against Germany, and the Germans increasingly irritated by the kind of things that the French are trying to do. So this tension is increasing, and it's starting to translate into personal hostility. And it is a fact, Scholz and Macron do not get on with each other.
Yeah, and what's interesting about this whole leak is there's so many theories of who leaked it, how it got leaked, right? I find that's fascinating. Of course, most people think, okay, it's a Russian, they have their ways, and of course,
No.
I still think that's probably most likely. But I think Alex Cristoforo said that it's possible MI6 and French security guys, they probably want to show Scholz, right? Because Scholz later said, okay, you guys have boots already on the ground, something like that, right? And this leak shows that Germany also heavily involved as well, planning something as outrageous as,
Yeah.
to attack the Kerch Bridge. And so they have incentive to do this, to get it
Yeah.
leaked. And then there are theories that, of course, China got it and gave it to Russia. Okay.
Yeah.
But I also think when I was talking to the German, my German friend, we actually think it's also possible the German leaked it because they want to stop this. Somebody within Germany, possibly the German military, is thinking this is too crazy, but they cannot stop it. So by leaking it, it's kind of stop this. And that's also possible. Of course, the CIA is another candidate. I just find the whole thing that I've never seen anything like that so many countries have their own incentives to record it and leak it. Isn't that interesting?
This is absolutely correct. I mean, there are lots of different people who, you can argue could have leaked it. And I should say that I had a long explanation why it was almost certainly China from someone. I mean, Chinese people who are the best at hacking, and that they've, got Taiwan, tied down and all of this. I mean, the only thing we know is that the Russians got possession of this recording, and it was they who published it. So if we're looking at who was responsible for this, it was whoever was responsible must have given it to the Russians.
Mhm.
And that implies some kind of contact with the Russians. And to my own personal view is that makes it most unlikely that it was anybody in the West. I think that for German or British or French officials to, launder information like this through the Russians would be politically incredibly risky. So I
Yes.
don't think it was anybody in the West. I, on balance, don't think it was the Chinese either, because if the Chinese did it, they would have get. Yeah, I've thought about this a lot actually. But if the Chinese got this recording and gave it to the Russians, I would assume that the Russians would need the permission of the Chinese before they published it. And China is striving for good relations with Germany at the moment. And I don't think China would want to see Germany embarrassed in that kind of way, in a way that might ultimately lead back to China itself. So I don't think it was the Chinese. The Russians have a very, very sophisticated intelligence system. We all know that. This is generals talking with each other using an insecure platform. And it's not difficult to imagine that the Russians would have been able to listen in on this call, and they clearly did. Um, the question of who leaked it, to my mind, is or should be secondary to what these people were talking about. And what they were talking about was horrifying. I mean, it was, acknowledgement that Britain and France, Britain especially, are already involved in the actual fighting in Ukraine. I mean, they're actually programming missiles to strike positions in Russia, and that the German military, and at the instigation of the German defense minister, are going behind the back of the German chancellor to plot an attack, not just on the Kerch Bridge, which is, of course, important Russian infrastructure, but potentially on other targets within what everybody acknowledges are Russia's borders. In other words, to, to, to undertake acts of war, because, launching missiles against another country is obviously an act of war. That all of this discussion is taking place, and in this completely casual way. They're happy to talk about it with each other, theorize as to how it could be done, all in preparation for a briefing of the German defense minister, a briefing it's clear the chancellor knows nothing about. And they're so casual and complacent about it that they're willing to do it on an insecure platform. I mean, it tells you how normalized thinking about war has become in Europe today.
Yeah, that's a very good point because now Biden, when he was talking about the ceasefire, he was holding a ice cream and leaking the ice
Yeah,
cream. That also really got to me. Like we're talking about life and death there, right?
yeah,
People are dying there in Gaza. And he's like, oh, my people are talking, about maybe Monday they will have some ceasefire. Just eating his ice cream, taking the whole thing very lightly, very casually, like you said.
yes,
That these people will have no connection to human lives, right? They don't
yes.
think that's serious matter they're working on, right?
Well, absolutely. I mean, this is, as I say, I mean, they're planning. I mean, Germany is not supposed to be at war with Russia, and yet they're talking in this way about committing acts of war against Russia. And the Kerch Bridge is civilian infrastructure. You might consider it illegal, but that doesn't entitle you to blow it up in this kind of way. I mean, that is an absurd thing. Whatever the Ukrainians might be doing, for the Germans to involve themselves in it is astonishing. Um, but they're happy to discuss that. There's no sign that any of these people involved in this call felt uncomfortable with the topic that they were discussing.
Yeah.
It left me appalled,
Mhm.
and you're absolutely correct. It shows a stunning indifference to human life, and the risk, the terrible risks that are being taken here, and a callousness, and a cynicism, by the way,
Mhm.
which is breathtaking.
Yep. Also, in the meantime, there are quite a few smaller countries that I'm not particularly comfortable. So let's start with Finland, right? The Finland's new president. They just elected a new president. Now he openly said he I think his name is Stops,
Mm,
Alexander Stops, right?
yeah.
He was saying that there's no limit for Finland's participation in NATO and would be ready to let nuclear weapons to be transported through Finland. Although he said not to store there. Well, but what does transportation even means, right? It's getting into pretty dangerous territory in my view. And he said we in Finland must have a real nuclear deterrent. Isn't that pretty troubling? That's, I would say, I mean, even I think this is pretty dangerous talk, but how Russia would react, obviously, right? And Sweden participated in this Taurus cruise missiles. As I just learned, we call it
Right.
German, Taurus cruise missile, but apparently Sweden was participating in it pretty extensively.
Yeah.
So this is before Sweden officially joined NATO. Sweden had still not officially
Mm,
signed the NATO treaty yet, right? But they are already deeply involved in all these things. And of course, Norway
mm,
bombed the Nord Stream pipeline, very actively participated that. Lithuania is just like 2 weeks ago banned the passenger train drop-offs and pickups from Russia to Kaliningrad.
mm,
Estonia, we talked about last time, that plans to move the Soviet soldiers' remains from the Tallinn military cemetery without the consent of the relatives. Don't you think all these small countries, they are jumping up and down, emboldened by NATO? Don't you think?
Well, absolutely. But again, they're acting in this way. First of all, it's unbelievably reckless. But I'm also going to suggest that it betrays a certain insecurity. When people behave in this reckless and needlessly provocative way, it is a sign that ultimately they feel insecure. They're conscious that, if the Americans do go away, which they might do one day, probably they will. Well, they've got an angry bear next door, the giant country, Russia, which they can't take on by themselves. And and that makes them very frightened. So they're doing all of these things, getting themselves into deeper trouble with the Russians in order to persuade the Americans of their undying loyalty and hope that that means that the Americans will never abandon them. I think that is the psychology. Now, Finland is a particularly sad case, in my opinion, because I ought to say I know Finland quite well. I used to go to Helsinki quite a lot. It's a beautiful city, by the way. And it was Finland, of course, was once upon a time a part of the Russian Empire until the October Revolution. Lenin supported Finnish independence. Finland always had an autonomous position within the Russian Empire. And economically, it did very well as part of the Russian Empire. And relations between Finns and Russians historically had been fairly good. Then, after the October Revolution, there was a sort of right wing shift in Finland. Finland fell under the fell into the sphere of influence of Nazi Germany. It participated in the Second World War. It played a big role in the siege of Leningrad, which is a horrendous event. But before the defeat of Nazi Germany, it had the wisdom to break away from the German orbit and to negotiate with the Soviets. And the Soviets said, look, we're not going to try and take you over. We're not going to try and bring you back under Russian control again. You can be an independent country with your own economic and social system. But you did all of these things to us. You participated in the siege of Leningrad. You were allied with the Nazis. You must commit yourselves from now on to be neutral. And Finland agreed. And that was the basis of a very significant rapprochement between Finland and the Soviet Union, and then Russia after the Second World War. And Finland benefited enormously from it. It not only was secure and at peace, It had no reason to fear Russia because it had excellent terms with Russia. And its economy boomed because it had access first to the Soviet market. It had privileged access to the Soviet market and then to the Russian market. And from being a very poor country, which it had been before the Second World War, it became a very prosperous country on the back of that. Now, all of that is being thrown away. We now have a situation where the economy in Finland, for a long time now, has been in bad shape. If you've gone, even when I was going to Finland, I stopped going there about 10 years ago, I could see a slow deterioration in what had been up to then a very high standard of living. And so the economy's in a bad way, it's getting worse. And from being in a situation where they were secure and at peace, we now have crazy talk about having nuclear weapons being shuttled around on their own territory. Now, I have Finnish friends, and these were genuine friends. They were not people I became friends with politically because of political views. Now they are becoming political, and they are bewildered by the speed with which this has happened. And you're starting to sense growing alarm and growing fear, a fear which hadn't existed in Finland before. So it is extremely sad.
Well, similar things in Sweden. When I was living there, I lived quite a few years in Sweden.
Mm.
Swedish people were very proud that this neutrality that kept
Yeah.
them out of a war for 200 years.
Yeah.
Something worked for them. And not only they are proud themselves that is neutrality policy, right, very consistent, but also they actually said quite a few Swedes told me that they think if the world everybody does what they do, everybody's neutral, we will have a lot fewer conflicts. I actually agree with that. I actually think if we all mind our own business, trying to be compromised, discussions, and maybe I do think we will have a fewer conflicts. Now you have this gigantic NATO that everybody thinking so powerful. Then whoever inside NATO emboldened, right? Then they started doing these things, acted like this. They really started, in particular, smaller countries. So like they feel like now I have the NATO behind me. I can say whatever I want. I can do whatever I want, and you Russian don't dare. I guess so. That's really I find actually it's making it more dangerous because if they keep on consistently, oh today's this one, tomorrow is that one, they keep on provoke, it will come to a point that Russian will say that's enough. Now, in
Yeah.
Chinese media, there is a saying that the killing chicken to warn the monkeys. Okay, so okay, so they're saying the media even speculating who's going to be that chicken. When Russian come to a point like we have to make example of somebody. And I think all these countries we talked about, these small countries, anybody could be a candidate, which means it's dangerous for any one of them to do these kind of provocative things, isn't it?
Absolutely, you're completely correct. I mean, again, the wise thing to do for any country is to make sure that the countries that you border upon are your friends. You not needlessly make them enemies. I mean, this shouldn't require discussion. I mean, it ought to be obvious. But you're absolutely correct. They're going out of their way to antagonize and infuriate the Russians, who, by the way, I speak to many Russians. I've been there many times. Most Russians don't care about the Baltic states. They've no interest in Finland. I mean, they at least they didn't until recently. Now it's changing. I mean, they weren't interested in a march on Tallinn or Helsinki. Why would they want to? But now, of course, that they see this extreme hostility of these countries, they're becoming hostile to them themselves. You're absolutely correct. It creates dividing lines, which ultimately leaves these small countries desperately exposed if the international position, the geopolitical landscape changes. And it astonishes me that nobody points this out to them. and nobody thinks about this. Um, if I mean, again, I have had some contacts with people in the Baltic states. I know that there are a few people there who think as we do. But then, of course, the kind of people in the Baltic states who would probably want to contact me are the kind of people who would say the kind of things that we do. But this is a reckless, dangerous policy which cannot end well.
And I also think I went back to look at the Article 5, and in NATO, I think there is some misunderstanding about the NATO alliances. The Article 5 provides that if a NATO ally is the victim of an armed attack, each and every other member of the alliance will consider this act of violence as an armed attack against all members and will take the actions it deems necessary to assist the ally attack. It deems necessary. So you see, that's the key words. That not necessarily means everybody would just started attacking that country. It just everyone kind of like, okay, this one member is being attacked, we all should be somehow alarmed. So I think that when time comes, they count on the whole NATO will act together to protect them. They might be disappointed.
Absolutely, you're completely correct about that too. I mean, people, by the way, have very little understanding of what the Washington Treaty actually says. I've had argument after argument with many people, for example, who seem to think that the open door is contained in the Washington Treaty, that the Washington Treaty provides for an open door, and that countries that want to join NATO have a right to do so, and that this is somehow contained in the Washington Treaty. It isn't, and nor does the Washington Treaty say, nor does Article 5 say that if one NATO country is attacked, another NATO country must immediately come to its defense and get itself involved in a war. That is not what the Washington Treaty says at all. And I get to say this, I don't personally believe that if there were a war, I mean, I hope this doesn't happen, sure it won't happen, but if there was a war between Finland and Russia, or indeed Estonia and Russia, which would end very quickly, I'm not convinced that people in America would be prepared to risk World War III and nuclear annihilation in order to save Estonia. And I think
Me
that
either.
is something.
I don't think that's it. Yeah, me either.
I mean, exactly. And again, encouraging people in Estonia to think otherwise is ultimately irresponsible.
Mhm.
If you were going to include these countries in NATO at all, and in my opinion, that was a huge mistake anyway. But if you're going to do that, you should have told them very clearly, look, NATO membership involves responsibilities as well as, and one of those responsibilities is that you work hard to make sure that you have good relations with Russia, because we do not want to be involved
Yeah.
in a conflict with Russia. And that means that you're going to look after Russian graves, protect the Russian language, give schools, that kind of thing. But of course, that was never done because, as you absolutely rightly say, American policy, and it is American policy ultimately that makes the decisions. American policy is to incite everybody against everybody.
Mm. In the Chinese media even said that some people even believe that this leak, the conversation, this online meeting between the German officials possibly stopped the World War III, because if really they did, if they carry out this plan, it actually quite possibly that will start World War III, that Russia might react in a very strong way. So, I mean, you add all these things together, we just talk about those small countries, provocation, etc. I think now I understand why China sent its envoy Li Hui to Europe now. Because when I first heard it, I was like, clearly China does not believe that China can stop this war. Is sending its Li Hui, but Li Hui's visit is to Russia, to Ukraine, but also Poland, Germany, and Belgium. So to me, it seems like Li Hui's trip, he is now in Europe. I believe his first stop is Russia. Next is Poland, I think. So it seems to me the goal here is to calm everybody down and do not escalate even more. I think that's what China is trying to do. Do you think that's what?
I think that's exactly correct. Now, I think the first thing to say is that I personally think it was the Russians who collected this recording, but I'm
Mm,
sure they got lots of other recordings as well. They probably felt comfortable about releasing this one, firstly because of the incredibly provocative language, but also because they weren't compromising their intelligence collection because it was done over such an insecure platform. But the Russians and the Chinese do exchange intelligence information. I think the Russians are keeping the Chinese very well briefed on everything that they know about Western policy with respect to Ukraine. And the Russians undoubtedly have known for a very long time about the British being involved
mm,
in providing missile guidance to Ukraine. The Russians have also been very well informed about what the French have been doing in Ukraine, that they were operating a kind of secret, basically assassination outfit from
mm,
Kharkov, which was sending people, including French mercenaries, who are not really mercenaries, French soldiers, deep into Russia to carry out covert operations there. The Russians undoubtedly knew all about this information we got from the Americans the other, short time ago about the CIA bases and all of these sort of things. So the Chinese know all about that too, because the Russians will have told them. They will have told them a lot more than we know, even now, because these are big, powerful countries that are well informed about these matters. And of course, China also has its own means of intelligence collection. And based on some of the things I know, in terms of electronic intelligence and signals intelligence, they're ahead of the Russians. So, these are two very well informed countries, and they can see how dangerous and reckless policy is. Now, last week on Thursday, Putin delivered his presidential address, his State of the Union address, as some call it,
mm,
to the Russian parliament. And he made a very important point. He said, look, we know what these people are planning. We know about the fact there's talk about sending troops to Ukraine to fight us. We know that there's talk about planning deep strikes against our territory.
mm,
And this, he said that obviously before the publication by the Russians of this leak, but it obviously referenced that. And he said, just remember, we also have these capabilities too. We have the means, if we choose to strike against the territory of countries that might be thinking of participating in long range missile strikes against our territory from Ukraine. We have that capability also. And I think it is inconceivable that Putin would have made a statement like that without discussing it with China. I mean, I think that's the first thing to say. I mean, Putin values Russia's relationship with China greatly. He will. I personally think he will have discussed it with Xi Jinping himself, and it will have been discussed at multiple levels. So that was a warning. That was a Russian warning. And now what we have is the Chinese, a top Chinese diplomat, is coming to Europe, and he's going to come and try and reinforce that message. He's going to say to them, "Look, where you're going is utterly reckless. It is completely irresponsible. You're risking, well, you've already, as a result of your irresponsible policies, provoked a war in Europe. And where you're going is going to provoke an even more dangerous war. So back off." Now, he's not going to say it in the way that I've just said it. I mean, if you follow Chinese diplomatic discourse, you always are aware of how carefully the Chinese choose their words, how measured in their language they are, how polite they always are. All this wolf warrior thing that you always hear about. It's absolute nonsense.
yeah.
Doesn't exist. It's a complete Western fiction. But that is the message I think he is intending to convey. Now, and the Westerners will understand it, but whether they will listen to these words of reason is an entirely different question.
Yeah, I think China does feel like they have to do something, that
No.
China have to keep on trying, even though I think China has no illusion that they will, that they will listen. Yeah. But the other thing is that Putin also talked about, warned the West about the nuclear war. Now, I actually take Putin's warning much more seriously than any other people's, because he doesn't do it easily and lightly. So that's why I think that's another thing that China's like, okay, let's just give it a try, give it another try. That's how I feel like the whole thing is about. Yeah, we'll see how it goes. But like you said, I don't think they will listen. Yeah, but
You've touched on a very important point, because one of the most frightening things that has happened, at least frightening to me, that has
mhm.
happened in the West, is that the West seems to have lost its fear of nuclear war.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
mean, they talk all the time about, oh, what the Russians are saying is a bluff. That, we can attack them, we can invade them, we can launch missiles deep into their territory, we can murder their officials, we can arm the Ukrainians with every kind of weapon that they want, we can instigate all kinds of problems on Russia's borders, and the Russians, despite having the world's biggest nuclear arsenal, will just sit back and let it happen. And of course, I don't think it is a bluff. I don't think what the Russians have is a bluff. I don't think the Russians are bluffing ultimately. But the point is that all of those Western leaders who say that, all those Western commentators who say, they seem to miss the fact that if they are wrong, there is no way back. If you start a nuclear war, if you miscalculate on something like that, then humanity, civilization, at least in the West, ends. And this was well understood during the Cold War. Chinese understand that. The Russians, by the way, also still understand that. But in the West, we don't take this fear of nuclear war seriously any longer.
yeah. That's how I feel too. I think some of the people in the Beltway, inside the Beltway, they don't
Mm,
take it seriously either. They
yeah,
just thinking either they don't think it's going to happen. They don't think Russia will do that. Some
yeah,
of them actually think they could themselves survive it. There's
yeah,
a recently report, the underground, they call it underground flats or whatever they call it, underground, they building underground stuff is selling really well. And those
yeah,
underground bunkers, whatever you call them, they have all kinds of equipment for food and drink, and even hospitals, small hospitals, well-equipped
yeah,
hospitals, etc. Seems like they're preparing for these kind of a catastrophe scenario, and believe somehow they could survive this. Some of them, I
yeah.
think they have means to survive this.
I know.
That's scary. That's
Well,
really scary.
it is absolutely terrifying, and it's. I mean, survive in what way? I mean, living
Yeah.
underground. But anyway, um, the Russians have picked up on all of this, and of course, there is this very influential commentator there, Sergei Karaganov, who we've actually interviewed on the Duran, and he's saying that what Russia needs to do is to make the West afraid of nuclear war again.
Mhm,
And that
mhm.
means reducing nuclear thresholds. And in fact, sometimes even taking demonstrative action with nuclear weapons. And he's even talked about exploding nuclear missiles in the atmosphere. Something of that kind. I mean, I find that, again, terrifying stuff. And I don't want that to see any of that. But um, even as I am alarmed by what he says and have pushed back against it, I understand where he's coming from.
Mhm. Yeah. And that's another thing that people are, even in Chinese media is discussing this so-called chicken, who will be the example.
Yeah,
Possibly one of those countries, and possibly Russia will use nuclear weapon towards one of those smaller countries and to make
well,
an example. Now I hope we don't go there, right? I
well,
like you. I'm very much against these kind of talk. But the reality is reality, right? If
yeah,
people truly continue to provoke Russia and not
yeah.
afraid of a real nuclear war, well, maybe we come to that point that Russia must do something to show the world I'm serious, and this could happen, something like that, right? I hope we
Well,
don't go. I hope
Well,
we don't.
absolutely. Well,
Yeah,
absolutely. I hope we don't. And I'm uncomfortable discussing these kind of
yeah,
scenarios. I think we all are,
yeah.
but it's important to say that we've been driven towards doing it because of this senseless, confrontational belligerence that we are getting from the Western powers. And the Chinese, I think you're absolutely right. They look and listen to all of this and they say to themselves, these people have taken leave of their senses.
Mhm. And that's the whole purpose, I think, is Li Hui's trip. Yeah, that's
I
what
think
he's
you're right.
doing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I do want to end our discussion on a little bit lighter note. Okay. Um, what is about the royal family, the British royal family? So there's a lot of drama there, right? So of course the King Charles has some health issue. The rumors that he doesn't have that long left, so that's one
Yeah.
rumor. And Kate Middleton has been disappeared for a long
Yeah.
time. What's strange about her is that is not even like from her own, like a spokesperson come out and saying, I thank the public concerned about me. I'm recovering well, stuff like that after my surgery. There's absolutely nothing coming from her. There are announcements from the palace, but not from her. So there are rumors that she's severely, really seriously ill. There's
Yeah.
rumors about that maybe she's not even alive. And then there's
Yeah.
rumors that she has been under house arrest. I mean, there are all kinds of, and
Yeah.
there is another royal death, Kensington, right? So what's going on here? What is the British talking about?
I think the first thing to say straight away is that I don't know what is going on, but it's fascinating to watch how this story has played out in the media here because obviously it's been reported, but there's clearly some kind of instruction which is not to report it too much. So you're quite right. The king is ill, and I mean, they've tried to downplay it. I should say that I have nothing against the king. I'm sympathetic to him. I think he's a amiable and harmless man himself. So I wish him well, and I wish him a long life. But there's some suggestions that he's terminally ill, and that this cancer, which is supposedly caught early, is actually developed further than it has. There is great mystery about what is happening to the
Okay.
to Kate Middleton.
Yeah.
I mean, there is a great deal of mystery. I mean, the story is that she had an abdominal operation, which tells us nothing. I mean, some people, by the way, I know are speculating that she's got cancer as well. Just
Okay.
say.
Uh-huh.
So, I mean, there are rumors, but I mean, these are just rumors. I mean, I don't know that that is true. But as you correctly said, no explanation of this. The Prince of Wales, William, we hardly see him.
Mhm.
And there was an event which another member of the royal family, I forget which one, was supposed to attend, and suddenly he cancelled. So, I mean, there is something strange going on, and the media clearly don't want to talk about it and aren't asking questions. And the British public is, but we've been kept in the dark.
Mhm.
Now, there is something I have to say about the British royal family, which is and the British monarchy, which is that, I mean, at one level, it is somewhat preposterous that a modern country in the modern world can still have a monarchy with a family that at the top of it, which is as important as this is. But of course, the difficulty about Britain is that in many respects it is not fully a modern country. Its institutional architecture is archaic. It basically stopped developing around 1850. I mean, its governmental structures are very complicated and difficult to understand. And the whole institutional framework revolves around the concept of the crown. The government is the king's government. They're the
Mhm.
king's ministers. He theoretically appoints them. The parliament is elected when he calls it. He has the power to dissolve it. He even has, in theory, the power to make legislation by himself without actually going through Parliament at all. The courts, the whole legal system, which I used to work in, is based on the theory that every judge is a representative of the king, and it's the king who's dispensing justice. So that's why the judge is on a throne with the royal courts of arms above him, and you bow before the judge when you enter a British courtroom. So the whole institutional system is based around the British monarchy. And we discussed earlier in the program the sense of insecurity that there is amongst the political class, which Galloway's election to Parliament has highlighted. And now it looks like at the very core and centre of British power, the monarchy itself, the royal family, there is some kind of fragility. And remember, the military, the king is their supreme commander in chief. And this isn't just symbolic. British military officers are drawn principally from the aristocracy, not the very highest aristocracy, but the level down. They have a personal connection to the king. The intelligence services report to the king as well as to the prime minister. They're already unsettled by the fact that the monarch that they really got accustomed to, Elizabeth II, passed away. The new monarch may be dying. There's uncertainties about the health of the rest of the royal family, probably in ways that are not obvious and we don't fully understand outside it. All of this is adding to the uncertainty and to the sense of insecurity that exists in Britain. In Britain, until very recently, however bad things were, you had in the Queen, Elizabeth II, a symbol of stability right at the centre. So whatever happened, there was always the Queen there, the ministers, the officials, the civil servants, the soldiers, the intelligence agencies, they could all talk to her. She also had real popularity in the country. She could relate to people. She was always very skilled at giving behind the scenes advice, keeping the whole thing operating. Without a functioning, strong monarch, at a time of political insecurity even further, it could be quite destabilizing what is going on. So, I mean, I wish all of these people well. I mean, I have nothing against the king, as I've said. I have nothing against Kate Middleton either. I think it's long overdue that Britain carried out proper reforms to its political system. But if we're all kept in the dark, we don't really know what's going on. We'll just have to wait and see.
You actually answered my follow-up question because one of my, what I want to ask you is that is it a good time to just, become a republic, get rid of the monarchy altogether? But it doesn't seem that easy, right? Because it's so entrenched into the society, into the whole government structure. So it's
absolutely,
yeah.
There is another major factor which is not to be underestimated, which is that, of course, if Britain becomes a republic, it's another English-speaking republic. In which case, what makes it different from the United States? And this has been a major factor in the British clinging on to their monarchy and the way that they do. They don't want to be just second-class Americans. So it's not something you ever see discussed or talked about in public, but I know this sentiment is fairly widespread and it exists. But certainly, Britain urgently needs major reforms to its political system. But of course, nobody advocates them. Nobody talks about that. And political systems, political classes that feel insecure tend anyway to be very, very resistant to reform. They cling to what they know. they become deeply, I mean, not just conservative, but reactionary in their outlook. And so that when change does come, it tends to be chaotic. That's what happened to the Soviet Union, by the way.
Mhm.
Soviets uh, uh, um, missed many chances and opportunities to develop their system. And that is why it became so brittle. So that when reform came, eventually came in a massive rush, and it quickly spiraled out of control. The Communist Party of China, the leadership of China, with far more experience, because China is this much, much older civilization with greater experience of statecraft. They understood that very well, and they never made that mistake.
Yeah, that's why in China they're saying, right, compared to the West, we don't change party, but we can change policies. So
Correct.
whenever there is
Absolutely.
a problem, they would do some reform, and sometimes
Yeah.
pretty painful reforms, and sometimes they do
Absolutely.
make mistakes, etc. But they know that they have to constantly reform and improve, and so even though you don't see the party change, but within the party there are also always a different debate and discussion. It's always ongoing. And yeah, whereas in the West, that you can change parties, but policies changes seems very hard. Yeah.
And the key thing was what you just said, because you see, and I've been reading, and I can only read the English language Chinese media, but there is discussion in China. There's actual discussion about problems in China. You don't get that in the West anymore. Um, I mean, there's there's arguments, and quarrels, and abuse and political conflict, but you don't actually have people sit down and say, look, there's a problem. There's problems in the educational system or the health system or whatever it is. Let's sit down and think through and discuss with each other what those problems are and look for ways to resolve them. And that happens in China, but it certainly doesn't happen in Britain. Because I know that because I live there, and I worked on the fringe of the British government, and I
Mhm.
saw how it worked. And, it was arbitrary and whimsical, and proper planning never happens.
Yeah. And also, I find the West, United States as well, is too
Mm,
heavily rely on election and on individuals. They
mm,
always believe, okay, somebody will save the day. There's this one person that for a while, Obama was the answer. Remember when he
yeah,
was running?
mm,
So everybody was like, okay, now we're saved. Obama
yeah,
elected, all the problems solved. He didn't solve
yes,
our problem. He
no,
didn't. He get
no,
us into more wars. Okay, so
no.
eventually he caved. I don't know what happened to him. He caved to the military industry complex and deep state. That's what he did. And
Exactly. And the same is true of Trump, by the way. A lot of
yeah,
people thought the same about Trump, that he was going to change everything. And of course, everything remained exactly the same.
yeah.
Mm,
So it's heavily rely on, okay, as long as
mm,
we have our election, whatever the problem will go away if we find the right person.
yes, yes,
That's just not going to
yes,
happen, seems to me
yes.
like.
There is political and cultural atrophy. And you can see that across the West. It's more extreme in some countries than in others, but every part of the West now suffers from it. And it's particularly pronounced in Britain, because as it was a very successful state for a very, very long time,
Yeah.
the political system became the outdated and obsolete political system became even more entrenched, and has never really been reformed or changed in a way that it urgently needs to be.
In a way, I can understand that. I just remember my grandmother lived to 101 years old. So when she died, it's a very weird feeling, because she has lived so long, ever since I was very young, she's always part of the family, even though I don't, live very close to her. But when I find out she died, it's not just the sadness, it's also like almost like a little bit uncertain about the future. You know what I mean? It's kind of like a
Yeah.
very strange feeling because she's always there. And
Yes.
it's like as long as she's there, everything will be fine. In a way, that is how I feel. Now, I know it's strange, but sometimes when people live really long, has been there in the center, that's the
Mm.
people around them, how they feel. So now we're talking about not just Elizabeth, the whole royalties. Are they going
Yes.
to be done? I mean, if they're gone, I can see why people
Yeah.
might panic about that.
Absolutely, you're completely correct, and of course, you already saw that when the Queen herself died. I mean, there was a sense that that focus both of loyalty and stability. And by the way, because this is something I've heard, I mean, I've never met the Queen myself. I've once on one occasion was physically quite close to her, but I've never spoken to her. But I know people who have done and who knew her in a kind of way. She was always a very sane person, very reasonable person, because she was outside the system and she was well informed and very educated and always spoken, advised ministers in a rational way. Anyway, with that person gone, there's a sense that, you know, there's the unknown lies ahead. And if the whole royal family now starts to tumble one after the other, then that will be even more disruptive and even more remarkable. Your grandmother, by the way, must have been an astonishing person
Yeah.
and a Chinese person who's lived 101 years. I mean, my goodness, what she must have seen.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, she was born 1899, so she lived, through the 1900, the 2000, and she died in 2000. So
So,
she passed, yeah, three very turbulent period within the Chinese history.
oh my goodness,
Yeah.
she was there when the Empress Dowager was alive.
Yeah.
I mean, so
Yeah, she experienced
my
all that.
goodness, all
Yeah.
that and goodness, yeah,
Absolutely. So
yeah.
she's a very interesting person. I can
I
talk
can
endless about
imagine.
her, even, but it's just like she seems like always the center of my mother's side. My
Yeah, yeah,
mother, they are totally eight of them, and she's the
yeah.
center. She's always the center. So
Wonderful.
when she's gone, it's like, what's going to happen? Like almost like
Yeah,
we kind of like very uncertain in a way. That's at least how I felt. So yeah,
amazing.
that's
Gosh.
how people people do. Yeah. All right. I was going to have something light to talk about. It's not that light.
It's not that light, but it is interesting and it is important. And
Yes, yes.
and I will say we are talking about people who I have a lot, I have a lot more time for and sympathy than some of the other
Uh,
people that we talked about. I mean, the Queen, as I said, was always a sane and rational person, and I think that the King is a very well-meaning person. I
I
don't think
agree.
he has the degree of, you know, soundness and understanding that the Queen did, or experience, of course. But I think he's fundamentally somebody who means well. I know there's lots of people who think otherwise, but again, everything that I've heard about him from people who've known him, and I've met a few people who have known him, is that he's basically a very well-intentioned man.
Yeah. Let's see what happens. Like you, I have no ill feeling towards them one way or
Yeah,
the other. I want them to
yeah.
healthy and back, but we'll see what happens.
So,
Okay. Thank you so much. Always very pleasant talking to you, and I always learn a lot from you. So thank you so much.
thank you very much, Sophia.